We're going to go on and get started tonight. It's good to see y'all made it here on time tonight. So 2 weeks ago, y'all showed up late. So last Wednesday, I just didn't show up at all. No, that's right. April Fool's on you. But no, I was not feeling very well last Wednesday, huh? April 7th to y'all, yep. It would have been April the 8th, right? April 8th. Yeah, April 8th. So, but yeah, I am definitely on the mend. Brother Jim texted me last Wednesday and he said, I'm sick, man. I got sinus infection going on. I said, me too, brother. So, and some other stuff too we won't go into mentioning, but anyways, it's good to have Pastor Jim back, and yeah, and Pastor Jim ended up with some bronchitis, but I'm on the mend. I'm feeling a whole lot and getting a lot better every single day. So, but anyway, everybody get handouts tonight. Needs handouts. Everybody get one that wants one. All right. Did you not get one, Miss Marie? Did you not get a handout? Did you get one? Well, your sister's pointing to you like you need one, and you didn't get one. Why not? They say like you wouldn't throw me under the bus or anything, right? All right. So, all right, we're ready to get started tonight. So a little bit of review from 2 weeks ago. Paul had traveled from Tyre. Paul and those with him made their way to Ptolemais, and he only spent 1 day there, but he didn't drag his feet. He found some believers there and began encouraging them and discipling them. The next day, they sailed to Caesarea. Remember, Caesarea was the seat of the Roman government in Judea. It was also the home of its governor, most notably Pontius Pilate. Luke shares that when they arrived in Caesarea, they arrived at the home of Philip. And what was Philip? Come on. He was a Billy Graham. He was what? He was an evangelist. Thank you very much. He was an evangelist. Now it's referred to as an evangelist, but it was a name that he lived up to, right? I mean, he preached the gospel there in Samaria with the Ethiopian eunuch there, the Gentiles. It's interesting because Philip once would have been fearful of Paul as a persecutor of Christians. You know, if I knew that there was somebody in the neighborhood that had it out for people that were members of Fellowship Baptist Church, you know, and had a habit of putting them to death, I wouldn't invite them to come stay at my house, right? And you probably wouldn't invite them to come to stay at your house either, right? But Philip opened up his house to Paul there. Luke tells us that in Philip's house he had 4 virgin daughters that prophesied. Most likely they had the gift of prophecy. We don't know exactly what the deal was there. We know that they didn't prophesy. At least Luke doesn't record anything that they prophesied while Paul was there. But who did prophesy something while Paul was there? Who was the prophet's name? It began with an A. Agabus. That's right, Agabus. And what was the message that Agabus had for Paul? Come on. He took Paul's own belt, right, and tied him up with it, and said the owner of this belt is going to go to Jerusalem, and this is what's going to be done to them in Jerusalem. God had a direct word and a visual illustration for Paul. Agabus's words to Paul were a warning of what awaited him in Jerusalem. Now, what did the believers there in Caesarea? What did they do in response to this warning? That's right. The same thing the ones in Tyre did. They got upset and did not want him to go. But Paul was going to be steadfast in his faithfulness. He was determined to follow God's leading. Paul said basically, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and if it's meant for me to die in Jerusalem, then so be it. He was willing to suffer whatever the cost was to live in obedience to God. I mean, I don't know that many that wouldn't look to Paul as a hero of the faith, right? But I wonder what kind of shape our world would be in today if everybody had the same intellect that Paul, the same idea, the same mindset as Paul. God, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. You know what I mean? If it means my life, that's okay. A lot of us, when it comes to sharing the gospel, we're fearful of what people might think, so we don't open our mouths, right? Just at fear of persecution or losing a friend or somebody not understanding. But Paul said, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. There's a work that needs to be done there. God has given me some words for them there, some insight, some correction that they need, and I'm going to go there, even if it means my death. So let's pick up reading tonight, chapter 21, beginning in verse 15. And it says, and after those days were passed, and he went up, and after those days we packed and went up to Jerusalem. Also some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, and brought with them a certain Nason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we were to lodge. So Paul arrived there in Jerusalem, but he didn't arrive by himself, did he? Despite the pleads of the believers there in Caesarea, some of them went with Paul, right? They were begging Paul not to go, right? Paul, you're going to die there. It's going to be bad for you there. Paul, please don't go. They begged Paul not to go because they knew of the dangers. God had already communicated through the prophet the dangers that awaited him, yet he didn't travel alone. Maybe they said, you know what, if Paul's going to go, if Paul's willing to risk it all, maybe we should go with them. Instead of their fears deterring Paul from going and causing Paul to be discouraged about going, Paul's courage motivated them to go. They knew that Paul would be sort of a marked man there, marked for death, facing death and in imprisonment, yet they decided to go with him. And certainly they had connected the dots, right? They connected the dots like the disciples did when Jesus was crucified, right? When Jesus was crucified, what did the disciples do? They took off. They went into hiding. Why? Because they said they may want to kill us too, right? Well, these in Caesarea here went into Jerusalem with Paul, and they said, we know Paul's a marked man. We know that he's probably going to end up dying if he goes to Jerusalem, but you know what? We'll go with him. If it means putting us in danger, we're willing to go. You see, Paul had the courage not only to face the dangers that awaited him, but his courage inspired others to do dangerous things, to do great things. That's an encouragement for us as believers, right? We should dare to do great things for God, to be used mightily by God. And does God want to use us mightily? But just a few, right? Pastors, preachers, just those. Those are the ones God wants to use mightily. No, He wants to use us all mightily, right? We just got to be willing to get out there and do it, right? Get out there and be obedient. And we see the example here. These people had went from begging Paul not to go to going with Paul. If we dare to be dangerous, we can inspire other people to do great things for God. Certainly God wants to do great things through all of us. Let's continue reading there in verse 17. And when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. Then when he had greeted them, he told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. So Paul arrives in Jerusalem there, probably in late spring. Certainly he arrived there before the Passover, because that was his plan, right, to get into Jerusalem before the Passover. And Paul began celebrating with those believers there in Jerusalem what the Lord had done. Now remember, Paul was bringing offering to the believers in Jerusalem that were given by Gentile believers. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 20. So certainly they would have been excited to receive that love offering there, but certainly they were more excited about what God was doing by way of Gentile believers. The Gentile believers who would have accompanied Paul, came with Paul into Jerusalem, would have been proof, right? God is working in the lives of the Gentiles. God is saving the Gentiles. God is adding to the body of Christ the Gentiles. And here's Brother Bob and Brother Bill and Brother Ben and Sister Sally and Sister Sue. They are proof that God is adding the Gentiles. He is working mightily in the Gentiles. This provided proof of what God was doing in the Roman world, a very bad place for Christians, yet God was working wonders there. Paul gave a detailed report about what God was doing. I mean, this was a testimony service, right? And Paul was testifying in detail. You know, hey, we were having this preaching service, and this brother came forward, and you know, and he was involved in this and this and this, and now he's been one of the greatest supporters of the ministry. Now he's serving here and doing I mean, Paul went into detail about what God was doing there. And it says that when they heard this, what did they do? Verse 20. When they heard this, they glorified the Lord, right? This was a testimony service that turned into a praise service, right? A worship service. They glorified God, the Lord. They didn't glorify Paul. They didn't glorify the other apostles, right? They glorified the guy that was in charge, right? Glorified the Lord. Let's continue reading there, verse 20. And when they had heard it, they glorified the Lord. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, and that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come." In verse 21 there, we see that little 3-letter word that nobody likes to hear, right? But, right? When you hear "but," it is rarely ever a good thing. Not that it doesn't happen, right? You know, we got this great thing going on and blah 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 blah. But, right? Nobody likes to hear "but." So Paul gets there. They're celebrating. They're worshiping what God had done, and they said, "Listen, there are these myriads of Jews." The elders communicated to Paul that there were tens of thousands of Jews that had been converted, but they still held tightly to the law. These would have been Jewish Christians that remained passionately devoted to the ceremonial aspects of the law. Now, I don't believe that they would have viewed the law as a means of salvation, right? Because to profess faith in Jesus Christ, you have to what? Forsake your works, right? And that keeping of the law was works, right? They couldn't keep the law. That's why Christ had to come, right? The law was to show us that we could not live up to God's standard. So I don't think these converts were keeping to the law as a means of salvation, but something that they felt passionately that you have to do, right? You have to do these things. Now these customs, these sacrifices, these rituals would have been established by God, and many in this transition, you know, they were trying to hold on to the law, but then they saw that Christ had done away with the law, but this was ingrained in them. You know what I mean? So they were struggling to let go. It was a time of transition, as we often hear about the book of Acts. And in this time of transition, they held tightly to these rituals and held tightly to these customs. Maybe even more so, because God had put these things in place. This same God that had now provided salvation for them and put these things in. So these things were important to them. So they placed faith in Christ, but they also wanted to hold on to their customs and their rituals. It's worth mentioning here that the apostles and the other leaders did not oppose these practices. They didn't say these practices, no, they didn't offer sacrifices anymore for the forgiveness of sins. But the apostles and the other leaders, they didn't oppose these practices. Even Paul commanded a toleration of such weaker brothers in Romans 14, verse 1, and 1 Corinthians 8, chapter 8, verse 10 there. The Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15 determined that while these practices were not maybe necessarily wrong, you don't impose them on the Gentiles. Basically, the Jewish council there in Acts said, you don't take Gentiles and turn them into Jews, right? You take Gentiles and see them come to Christ, see them become Christians and disciples, right? You see Jews become Christians and disciples, but you don't force Gentiles to become Jewish just because they place faith in Christ. Paul says there's certain things that we can tolerate of our weaker brothers, and we should do these things. James and the elders communicated to Paul that the Judaizers, the Judaizers, they were a whole different set there, right? The Judaizers said if you want to be saved, you've got to keep the law, right? So James and the elders communicated to Paul that the Judaizers had been speaking lies about them. They said that Paul was teaching all the Jews to forsake the law of Moses and not to walk according to their customs. Now, the Judaizers, they were long-term opponents of the gospel of grace. They denied salvation by grace and taught that the keeping of the Mosaic law was required for salvation. Much of the writings that Paul did in Galatia was dealing with this same issue, dealing with this false teaching. And once again, you remember the Jewish council fairly clearly rejected these false teachings. The elders realized that this was going to be a problem. The elders, they understood that these rumors would hurt Paul's credibility with the Hebrew Christian community, which still had a great respect for the Mosaic law. Even more so, these lies about Paul would hurt the Jerusalem church's efforts in seeing unbelieving Jews come to know Christ. If Paul showed a respect for their beliefs and their customs, they'd be more apt to listen to what he had to say about Christ and what they had to say about salvation. And it's not the same with us today. It's a little bit different in the day in which we live. But when we talk to people, we need to show that we can listen, you know what I mean, and that we respect where they've been from. We respect what they understand. Now, if they're wrong, we don't have to agree with them, right? But we need to give them an opportunity to speak. Paul, if these lies about Paul would hinder the Jerusalem church, it would hinder Paul's efforts in seeing the unbelieving Jews come to know Christ. If he had no respect for the Jewish customs and rituals, which Paul was a Jew, right? He grew up through these same things. Then they would not be open to hearing about the gospel, to hearing about Christ. These were, of course, lies. Paul had never taught that Jewish Christians had to abandon their heritage. He never taught that, right? He only taught that the Gentiles should not be forced to become Jewish. The elders saw this as such serious accusations that it had to be addressed there. Let me see, where was I at? Basically, the Jewish elders said these people are going to hear that Paul has came into town. Okay, there's all these lies being told about Paul. They're going to hear that Paul has came to town, and this is going to cause a problem. It's going to cause an issue. This is something that we need to address and something that we need to deal with. So they come up with this plan. Verse 23. They tell Paul, therefore, do what we tell you. we have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you, the lies that they've been told about you concerning you, are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. And we talked about those things. Some of those things sexual immorality would be just wrong. But then once again, some of those other things that the Gentiles would be free to do would affect their witness and seeing people come to know Christ. So these elders, they come up with a plan. Now, this plan was not a compromise. It was not an admittance of guilt. Okay, Paul says, I've been doing these things, and I'm not going to do them. It was not an admittance of guilt. It was an act of humility to promote unity and understanding, to further the gospel. The elders, they share with Paul that there were 4 men who were under a vow. Most likely that was a Nazirite vow. I don't know of any other vow that it would have been. Certainly there were some other vows, but and certainly Nazirite vows often involved eating, drinking certain foods, or not eating and drinking certain foods, growing your hair long. Some took a Nazirite vow for life. You know what I mean? Some it was only for a time, so they would let their hair grow long, and then the completion of that vow, they would shave their heads. So Nazirite vows involved certain foods, or not drinking certain foods, and not drinking certain foods. Good gracious. Not eating certain foods and drinking certain drinks. Allowing your hair to grow long, not touching dead bodies and dead things. And we know Samson, right? He just blew all out of the water, didn't he? But on occasion, a person having experienced a defilement, a ritual defilement during their Nazirite vow, could go through a purification ritual of sorts. And maybe that is the case that is going on here. We don't know. These 4 men had taken a vow, but they needed to go through this purification process. And they were basically saying, hey, Paul, you go with them as their sponsor and go through these things with them. Don't know why Paul would need to go through it. Some have suggested that Paul, having returned to Israel from the Gentile lands, was considered ceremonially unclean, and now to participate as their sponsor in this ceremony, this ritualistic purification process himself. But ultimately, it was to show proof that Paul had respect for the Jewish rituals, the Jewish customs. He wasn't compromising anything, but showing respect for their heritage. Another way that Paul could show respect for their Jewish traditions, not only to go through it with them, but to do what? To pay up, right? He paid for their haircuts, right? He paid for that, and I don't know how much it was, but it must have been substantial, or maybe these guys didn't have anything. But it was worth mentioning in here that Paul would pay for their pay to have their sacrifices done, to pay to have their. I don't think it says to pay to have their heads shaved, but to pay for the sacrifices, and maybe you did have to pay for having their heads shaved. I don't know. But James basically said, in doing this, it would show that these were only lies told about Paul by these Judaizers. He reiterates here that this did nothing to compromise the determination of the Jewish council pertaining to the Gentiles and the law. Paul did as he and the elders had agreed. Once again, this was not a compromise of biblical truth, as Paul had written in Romans chapter 14 and 15, but a matter of Christian liberty. Paul was accommodating the Jewish believers there and accommodating the Jews, which would give Paul an opportunity to speak with them about the gospel. Now, I don't think Paul was in error in doing anything that he did. If he did take a Nazirite vow there, he had already taken one, right? In his second missionary journey, Paul took a Nazirite vow there and was headed to Jerusalem there to have his head shaved. I don't see that Paul did anything to compromise any biblical truth. As a matter of fact, he was in line with the truth that he had been teaching and preaching there in Romans. Certainly, if this would have been something that Paul had done wrong. We know the Bible. The Bible is a very transparent book, right? It tells people's good aspects and their bad aspects, right? So certainly if Paul had done something wrong, you would think that Luke would have communicated that to us. Paul had a pure motive. He had a desire to not hinder the witness that they would have had with the Jewish believers there. So that's why he did these things. Any questions or comments tonight before we move into our prayer time? All right. Let me get these announcements out of the way. I should have done those at the beginning, but let me get these announcements out of the way. So next week we have our quarterly business meeting. Encourage everyone to come and be part of that. It shouldn't be that big a deal, but we do have our quarterly business meeting next Wednesday, and then the Wednesday after that, the plan will be to continue here through chapter 21, where everybody's fears kind of come to the head as Paul is arrested there in the temple. Don't forget our Awana Derby workshop next Sunday night. There'll be no Sunday night discussion. There'll be no Awana. There'll be the Awana Derby workshop. If you have children or grandchildren that are building cars, you can come out and be part of that. If you don't have children, come anyway. We've got some parents that could probably use some help with that. You know, you have multiple kids, it's a challenge to help all of them. So if you don't have a grandchild or a child that's in the Awana Derby, come and I'll loan you one of my kids. You can help one of my kids with it. Let's see here. Awana Derby workshop, quarterly business meeting. Do what? That's a good question. What time is that Derby? It's the workshop. Yeah, it's the workshop. Let me see here. Is it in there? I would think so. I'm sorry. It's not in the Derby is in the bulletin at 5:30. What time's Awana usually start? 6 o'clock. I imagine it would go from at least 6 to 7:30, probably with a regular Awana time is what I would imagine. But if you show up at 5:30, there'll be people here. So, and the Awana Derby starts at 5:30. A couple other things in the future. We have our dessert auction coming up there. The ladies have a tea party thing. There's been some flyers. There's not a sign-up sheet up yet, but there will be a sign-up sheet up. There's a sign-up sheet. There you go. Sign-up sheet is up for that women's event, garden tea party coming up. Heal baby shower, April the 26th. We got a Heal baby shower for Mason and Paulina and the little boy, right? Do we have a name for the little boy, or are we still keeping it low-key right now?
We're open to suggestions.
Okay. David is a great name. It's a strong name. Just, all right.
The workshop.
Do what?
Anne Marie said 5:30 for the workshop.
5:30. See there, 5:30. Same as the Derby. So we have that baby shower coming up. That'll be right after church on April the 26th. Soccer's going on. I have the dates when the soccer games start, but I don't have them in front of me. But we're still having our soccer practices on Monday nights. You know, it's good. They have a scrimmage. Both the little kids and the big kids scrimmage on Monday nights. So if you show up at practice starts at 6:15. It goes to 7:45. That we won't be selling refreshments at the practices. We will when the tournaments start. But you could come and see some good scrimmages. And meet some families. I enjoy showing up. I'm not helping coach this year during the spring ball, but I enjoy walking around and meeting families and talking to families. So that's a good thing. We got at least 3 families maybe, that they had their first season with us in winter ball, and now they're out there at the spring ball. So it's good to see them. So. All right, all those announcements. Now let's get into our prayer time.
Really quick, the picture on
yeah. This is that picture. There you go. You see Mr. Young Tommy and Mr. Young Terry right there? And all those young children there. That's Jacob in there. There's Lindsay in there. I think that's Kendall Kendall on the end there, Andrew and Aaron there. No, not Aaron, Jared. It's Jared there. So that was the visual illustration I was talking about that kind of stick with us. And I don't. Yeah.
The balloons never popped. That's just how many
Yeah.
things that they could fit on there. There was everybody else was just.
We had them hanging off of there, and none of the balloons popped. I think that's the in-score girl who's got her back turned. I won't swear.
Jessica.
Jessica, but I think it is her right there. Those hanging in the back, I don't know who they were. But anyway, we put as many as we could on there. So there you go. If you're ever teaching on faith, there you go. You got an illustration. No tables were harmed in that illustration. Probably some balloons got busted after it was over with. But anyway, all right. So prayer request night. Keep Ben Dupree